There he is. Thanks. Well, welcome everybody to our first ILEC webinar of the fall semester. I'm Andy Johnson. I'm one of the founders of the International Literacy Educators Coalition. We've got a great list of speakers this fall, and I'll put that in the chat box. I'm short on introductions, but I want to say I've been reading Paul Thomas's stuff, and he is an amazing writer. He cranks the stuff out. Everything is well cited, and he's written some great articles for the English Journal. We teach English in times of perpetual crisis. If you have a chance, I would really encourage you. So I will shut up, and Dr. Paul Thomas, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Andrew. I really appreciate ILEC and Andrew and everybody that's making this possible. And of course, all the participants, a lot of good friends and people I respect and appreciate in literacy community. So just last week, I'm at Furman University and I started my 41st year as an educator. And I spent the first 18 years of that as a high school English teacher. And then I've been at Furman University now for 23 years. And over that career, I would say that the consistent thread has been that I'm a literacy educator and a literacy scholar. Um, I do often like to point out that my work is mostly looking at how we talk about literacy, the claims that are made sort of in the media by political leaders, and how that matches the reality of the evidence that we have. I'm not really someone who is speaking to or about how to teach children to read. I have a great deal of respect for the literacy educators out there who are doing that. But I do know the research and I do know the sort of discourse around literacy over the past about 100 years because of my doctoral work. I was very lucky to have a doctoral program grounded in the history of how we speak about and how we do research on, and then how we actually practice the teaching of literacy. And tonight's webinar is, I would say, the sort of the newest arc of my work. I have been writing and speaking out against the science of reading movement since 2018, sort of rooted in the media and the journalism of Emily Hanford, her article Hard Words, and then her, her probably her most influential work is her podcast Sold a Story. And so I've been doing that work now since 2018. And what has happened over that time for me is it's gone from a very misleading media story to actual education and policy and reading policy. And at least, 30 or so states have passed very specific science of reading legislation. I would honestly say it's probably at least in the high 40s, if not every single state has some version of reading policy and reading legislation that acknowledges or speaks to or about the science of reading. And so tonight, what I'll be talking about is, in this newest arc, is I've decided to focus on how the science of movements fit into the last 40 years of education research that began with A Nation at Risk. And I see that education reform as industry. The point of education reform in the United States is to perpetuate education reform. I've been very frustrated over my career because it very much parallels this exact movement. I entered the classroom in 1984, and in my home state of South Carolina, that was the first year of the major sort of education reform legislation in South Carolina. And we were one of the early states that responded to A Nation at Risk. So I am going to be looking at just the science of reading, but if you're you're paying attention, there's now the science of math, there's the science of learning, the science of tag has grown and expanded across almost all of education since 2018, especially in the last couple of years, um, grounded in an overreaction to NAEP testing, and a little bit into international testing, but mostly with the NAEP testing. So I called that kind of education reform that perpetuates itself Trojan horse education reform, because I genuinely don't think that most of these reform cycles are intended to improve education. Um, and I'll sort of walk us through why. So the first example that I have is the charter school movement. And so in 2005, when Katrina hit New Orleans, an interesting phenomenon happened, and then Governor Jindal um, essentially fired all public school teachers. And over the course of the next, decade or so, New Orleans became an entirely charter school district. And they had to rehire educators in these schools, and many of them were from Teach for America. And then just recently, sort of a fascinating phenomenon has occurred because New Orleans declared that the charter school shift had not made any improvement on outcomes for students. And that is over. And what is really frustrating is the end of this charter school experiment in New Orleans. The end got almost no fanfare, got almost no national media attention, but the movement itself got tons of coverage by the media, including entire books written on the transition to um, charter schools from public schools. And I think it's really important as we think about the science of reading movement, the vast majority of the public school teachers who were fired in New Orleans were professional Black teachers. So there was this erasure of, a Black middle class, professional class of educators, many of who moved to Texas. And there was very little attention paid to that. And as I'll point out in a minute, particularly at the early grades, teachers are primarily women. And this is really important, I think, to understand why the science of reading movement itself is not about improving education. It's certainly not about improving teachers as a profession. You'll notice some terms here: recovery school districts. States like Tennessee were heavily funded by Bill Gates, and there was a huge recovery school district and achievement school district movements in Tennessee. Again, these did not produce outcomes that were promised, and many of these reform so-called projects, often funded by billionaires, have kind of just quietly ended. As was mentioned a minute ago, Elena will be one of the next webinars, and I highly recommend. She has 2 or 3 pieces out now, and I think she has at least one more coming out. She's doing some of the best, uh, scholarship, I think, on the science of reading movement. And the key here is that she is couching it as a conservative education reform movement. And I think a lot of people struggle with that. And that's one thing I'll try to give you some foundation for today, is how the science of reading movement is essentially conservative. One way to understand that is two of the key points here in conservative education reform. One was Teach for America, and the other is the National Council of Teacher Quality. NCTQ is a Fordham Foundation offspring, and the Fordham Foundation is in Ohio, and it is a school choice, very conservative school choice organization. Teach for America is a very interesting organization. In its sort of foundation and heyday, it was an extremely conservative movement that was anti teacher education. And the tie here is that NCTQ and TFA are exclusively anti-teacher education. So when you look at some of the elements of the story that I'm going to point to in a minute, there's no surprise that the science of reading movement is grounded in a very negative and I would say not grounded in evidence attack on teacher education. The key, I think, to understanding how the science of reading movement fits into a conservative education reform movement is that since the early 1980s, education reform has produced one thing: churn. There is a crisis, there's reform, and then there are a few years pass, and then another crisis is declared, another set of reforms are declared, a few more years pass, and this is the cycle. If you pay close attention, many states in the United States since the 1980s have had between at least 3, and I think in my home state, it's been 7 different cycles of standards. And states will repeatedly revise their standards, change their testing. And when that happens, I think it's really key to understand that a component of the new standards and the new testing is always new education programs. These are different textbooks that have to be calibrated to the new standards, to the new tests. And so a central feature of education reform and churn is that it feeds the education marketplace. Way back in the 1990s and into the 2000s, the center of that was George W. Bush. George W. Bush's tenure in Texas, he declared the Texas Miracle. And one thing that he was trying to implement in the 90s was scripted curriculum. By the time that he was in the White House and by the time that No Child Left Behind came out, his efforts to implement scripted curriculum had kind of died out. A colleague of mine, Nita Schmidt, and I had a book on scripted curriculum in the 2000s, and really, I, I I've been very disappointed because I really felt like at the time, by the time the book came out, it appeared that we had, as educators, the entire country had stemmed the tide on scripted curriculum, and as you'll see in a minute. The key thing to understand about the science of reading movement is it has been a Trojan horse saying we're going to teach the science, but what has really happened is it is allowed through the back door scripted curriculum being adopted across the United States. Another element of this movement, the science of reading movement, is the bad teacher myth. And this was a major narrative under Obama. A good friend of mine, Adam Bessie, had a really good article in Truth Out, and he uses that terminology, bad teacher myth. I refer to this a lot. That's where the hyperlink goes to Adam's work. And the idea was that if not one of the main reasons that schools are failing and students are failing is because of the incompetence of teachers in the United States. I cannot stress enough, when we're attacking elementary school teachers, when we're attacking teachers of beginning literacy, well above 70, nearly 80% of those teachers are women. This is an attack on a workforce that's primarily women. Teacher educators are also overwhelmingly women. I don't generally quote a statistic here. It's interesting to me. It's very difficult to find an exact number, but often teacher educators parallel the workforce in K-12, and I imagine teacher educators are close to the same percentage. The misleading story that you will find in Emily Hanford's journalism and in her podcast is well laid out by Marna Ackerman, who does outstanding work on this. She has 3 very, very good online pieces through LRA that are open access, and I highly recommend her work. And you'll notice the 4 points here that she identifies about the science of reading story. Science has proved that there is just one way of teaching reading effectively to all kids using systematic, highly structured approach to teaching phonics. Second, most teachers rely instead on an approach called balanced literacy, spurred on by shoddy teacher education programs. And third, therefore, teachers incorporate very little phonics, encourage kids to guess at words. Balanced literacy and teacher education are thus at fault for the large number of children not learning to read well. Two things to emphasize here is I think Ackerman's overview of the story that is behind the science of reading is perfect. I think that is accurate. You'll see it in news articles over and over and over. Most journalists are just repeating the story that Hanford laid out in 2018 and then in Sold a Story. But also very important is these elements of the story are not grounded in science. Science does not back up that there is a reading crisis. There's no scholarly or scientific research showing that there's a causal relationship between balanced literacy and a crisis. And I'll just point out here that, it's according to the data that you can find, roughly at the most 20% of schools in the country were using Lucy Calkins units of study. If you listen to or read Emily Hanford, if you listen to or read the New York Times, it's the clear message is that somehow Lucy Calkins and units of study only being in 1 out of every 5 schools destroyed the entire literacy of a country. That makes absolutely no sense. Not only is there no research, there's no logic to the argument. The truth is that the United States has a ton of variety. And for 30 years in the United States, since the 1990s, NAEP reading scores have been essentially flat. And over those 30 years, dozens of reading programs, dozens of reading philosophies, hundreds of different practices have been implemented in the United States. We simply do not have any sort of unified, singular approach to teaching reading. And despite the program, despite the reading philosophy or theory that is embraced, reading scores have been essentially the same for at least 30 years. But regretfully, these stories are very compelling to the public. They're very compelling to politicians, and then they're very welcome by publishers. The best thing that can happen to the education marketplace is that schools drop one reading program and are forced to buy another. The huge irony of this is the same people own the programs that are being banned in the United States and the ones that are being adopted. So I'll go back to the churn. The science of reading is being promoted in one part by the education marketplace for that churn because there's profit in churn. There's absolutely no profit in the United States for a education reform to work, which is really discouraging. So I think this is one of the most important studies that is out right now. It's by Westall and Cummings. It's from this year. And despite many states reforming their reading programs and reading legislation, the only states that are showing any measurable gains in test scores are the ones with grade retention. When people say that the science of reading reform has improved scores in such and such state, and they'll often point to Mississippi and Florida, that simply isn't true. The determining factor in every one of these states is grade retention. Keep in mind, grade retention pulls out the lowest scoring students from the testing pool, and reintroduces them when they are biologically older. We have some good evidence that biological age matters in narrow reading testing because in England they do phonics checks. It's mandatory. It's been mandatory since 2006. We've got many, many years of phonics checks being done in England, and phonics checks, the scores improve by birth month. Each month older the students are, the higher the average score. So the truth is, what may be happening in many states is that standardized test scores are being inflated by changing the testing pool of students and removing the lower scoring students and reintroducing them when they're biologically older. The huge problem with that, of course, is it's misleading to the public. And then second, that there are huge negative consequences to grade retention. Grade retention is still mostly correlated and causally connected to students dropping out of school. I do want to point out that it's really important to know about test data. Mississippi and Florida have seen increased scores in grade 4 reading. Two facts. Neither state has seen any change in the race achievement gap. So, for instance, students of color, Black and brown students in Mississippi and Florida still perform at about the same gap as white students in those higher scores in grade 4. The other important thing to know is both Mississippi and Florida have very low grade 8 reading scores. Mississippi's grade 8 reading scores remain at the bottom of the country, and Florida has the largest drop from grade 4 to grade 8 of any state in the country. This suggests, again, that the grade retention is creating a mirage, that it's not a real achievement bump, it is a manipulation of test data. Therefore, my argument is that Trojan horse education reform doesn't work to improve teaching and learning, but it does work for the media, it does work for the market, and it does work for political interest. And I do not think that the science of reading movement is unique in that sense. Actually, I think it fits right into things like school choice, the charter school movement, the value-added method movement for evaluating teachers, the standard movement, the high-stakes testing movement, the accountability movement. Essentially, any education reform movement you can identify since the 1980s has the exact same pattern. It's crisis, reform, reform doesn't work, more crisis, reform, reform doesn't work. And again, the real motivation for this is the churn and the media market and political capital that's built by that. Recently, a new organization called the Evidence Advocacy Center posted their plan for injecting evidence-based practice into the teaching of reading. This quote is very chilling, so I'm going to read the whole thing for you. In the EAC's plan for the transformation of the profession into an evidence-based system, educators will relinquish certain freedoms, notably the leeway to employ effective practices, but will gain guidance that empowers them to fulfill their original purpose by profoundly impacting the future of students, families, and communities. The alternative is to continue rearranging the deck chairs under the guise of education reform. Two things that I think are important here is what I've highlighted. Educators will relinquish certain freedoms. One, I think it's offensive to suggest that teachers have been autonomous to begin with. The teaching profession has been under no mandates again for at least my career. Since the 1980s, there's much of education has been standardized. The whole concept of standards. Um, Teachers are under a great deal of accountability and held accountable for, are you teaching the same? One thing that I would say that is consistent in our field is teachers are held accountable for teaching standards, not for teaching students. Also, if there's been any mistake in reading, it's how often teachers are held accountable for implementing with fidelity a reading program as opposed to teaching children to read. And the science of reading movement has doubled down on that. It's become even more intensified. Um, what I find ironic here is there's this hint about the rearranging chairs on the deck of the Titanic. And I've used that metaphor myself because I think that's exactly what the science of reading movement is doing. Every time we just say this reading program or this reading philosophy didn't work, but this next reading program and this next reading philosophy will work, that's exactly what that is. There's no evidence that reading programs have failed. There's no evidence that reading philosophies have failed or reading theories have failed. Um, but we just stay in that constant cycle. Um, if you're familiar with The Handmaid's Tale, um, again, I think it's a very chilling quote. It's a quote from the novel. There is more than one kind of freedom, said Aunt Lydia, freedom to and freedom from. In the days of anarchy, it was freedom to. Now you're being given freedom from. Don't underrate it. We were a society dying, said Aunt Lydia, of too much choice. And I think that is the sentiment of the science of reading movement. They're the advocates for the science of reading movement think that teachers and teacher educators had too much choice. And the new argument is that you're better off if you have freedom from, for instance, having to plan your own lessons. And now you have the freedom to implement scripted curriculum. Um, I do not buy this, and I do not think that that's what teachers want. As a matter of fact, I think there is currently a pretty significant backlash to this ideology. Um, Certainly, teaching and learning conditions are overwhelming for a lot of teachers. And I'm not suggesting that teachers don't need access to programs, but I actually don't think one program or the other is the issue. How many students are is a teacher teaching? What's the school day like? What kind of support do they have? What kind of support do the children have? The thing that's often left out of any of this is the current research that we have. Teacher influence on measurable student outcome is between 1 and 14%. 1 and 14%. Teacher impact on learning, which would include the quality of the programs they're teaching and the ability they have to implement those programs. However, the influence of out of school factors, it still remains, and there's a brand new study out in 2024 that replicates the same statistic that we've had for many years. Um, the influence of out of school factors on measurable student learning is 64%. There's some research out of England that it's as high as 80%. So again, we are, I would say education reformers hyper focus on teachers and hyper focus on reading programs, and while distracting us from the things that are more likely to be impacting student achievement, and especially in reading. There are tons of things that we know we could do to improve children acquiring literacy, and one is access to books in their home, access to books in their community, and access to books in their schools. And one of the things that's very disturbing about the science of reading movement is overlapping with another very conservative movement in the country, and that's censorship and banning. Um, Librarians are losing their jobs. Libraries and schools are being stripped of books. Books aren't just being moved to different sections, which is enough of a problem, but actually books are being removed and destroyed. And so there's this huge contradiction in the country that somehow that we can teach every student to read. That's another thing you'll hear is we can teach 95%, 90%, 95% of students to read at grade level. But then there's the problem of what are they going to read if they don't have access to books. So again, the reason that I think it's important to identify how this is a conservative movement is who is benefiting from the reading crisis, who is benefiting from replacing one set of reading material with another, and some of the key actors. This is from the organization. Don't want to say it wrong here to y'all. It's the Evidence Advocacy Center. If you scroll down their organization page, you see the Reading League. Interesting, you see the Science of Math organization. You see multiple reading leagues, state level. You see National Council National Council for Teacher Quality, the 95%, Deans for Impact. These are all very conservative organizations. As I mentioned before, NCTQ was founded in around 2000, 2001 by the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, which is a school choice organization in Ohio. Their key interest of the Fordham Institute is school choice. Dibbles is getting a huge bump. Dibbles had its first day sort of right after No Child Left Behind National Reading Panel, but it did not stick in the 2000s, but now it has been revitalized, and it is out of the University of Oregon. And I think it's one of the most dangerous things out there because it is a nonsense word assessment. Nonsense word assessments are big in England also. I think there's no value in nonsense word assessments, and I think they're also very harmful. There's actually evidence that students who come to school already fluent readers score very poorly on tests of nonsense words because they are already looking for meaning. Nonsense words eradicate the the value of meaning and pronouncing words. And I've often done this, but DOVEWIND, you do not know how to pronounce those out of context. They have multiple meanings, they have multiple pronunciations, and without context, you really don't know if it's dove or dove. You don't know if it's wind or wind. There is no point in pronouncing a word other than meaning. And so I think nonsense words are very harmful, and it's a reductive way of assessing reading. I do include the trademark there. That's how you will see Dibbles written, and there's a reason for that, in my view. This is about programs. This is about market. This is about selling. Same thing with Letters, which is a teacher training program by Louisa Moats. States are spending tens of millions of dollars to buy letters and to train teachers. Just 1 year recently, my home state, which is the 10th poorest state in the country, spent $15 million on letters training. Again, the great paradox of letters is there's no scientific research showing that letters improves student reading. There's a little bit of evidence that letters improves teachers' beliefs about their ability to teach reading, but there's no connection to improving student achievement in reading. But it does generate a huge amount of money for the publisher. The Reading League also is one of the biggest voices behind the science of reading movement. If you'll go to their page, one of the things I think that jumps out is they're strong supporters of decodable text. And ironically, again, there's no scientific research to support decodable text. So you get this contradiction of the science of reading advocates saying that the only thing that we can do in a classroom has to be supported by a very narrow definition of science. But then at the same time, science of reading includes advocacy for things that have no science behind them. I'm actually not taking a stance one way or the other. I'm concerned about the contradiction. the science of reading advocates are as much pickers and choosers as anybody else. And what's interesting to me is their picking and choosing is okay, but other people's is not. And that's where I really get upset about all this. One of the most fascinating things in the science of reading movement is this. Now I've seen three different numbers. It's the 95% group, the 96% argument, and the 90% argument. There's this weird claim out there that 90, 95, or 96% of children can learn to read. What I've yet to been able to figure out is what do they mean by that? I'm not sure if that means at grade level, and I'm not sure if they mean by when. But I did a review of a national of NCTQ report recently, and they had this claim in there. And when I went to the footnote, it went to a blog. Um, there is no scientific research supporting that claim. So this 95% group, or if you see 96 or 90%, there's a study, I think from 2004. It's a very small study, and it is basically makes an aspirational claim that maybe this is something we can achieve. There's absolutely no body of evidence showing that 95% of students can be, I don't know, proficient at reading by grade 3, which I'm assuming that's sort of what they're suggesting, but they never really pinned that down. Also in the background is dyslexia advocacy. One of the roots of the science of reading movement is the International Dyslexia Association. This blog is from 2014, I believe. It is still up. It is not something they're ashamed of. But the International Dyslexia Association came up with the term structured literacy. And as you will see, structured literacy will help us sell what we do so well. So now that many states are mandating structured literacy, I think it's important to point out the sort of market grounding of the terminology. Also very interesting, you'll see Orton Gillingham mentioned there. Currently, the best scientific studies we have on Orton Gillingham is that it is no more effective than other strategies. Multisensory approaches to teaching reading to either students with dyslexia or learning struggles, or with so-called mainstream students. There is no research that it's more effective than anything else. Again, however, Orton Gillingham training is incredibly expensive. You'll see Orton Gillingham and structured literacy are at the center of banning reading programs in New York City and adopting new programs in New York City. Again, there are people benefiting from these, baseless claims, but it's not students and it's not teachers. Simultaneously with that, notice here that not too long ago, the Education Writers Association had a post about Emily Hanford and her work in the science of reading. And you'll notice Hanford encouraged reporters not to write stories 2 years from now with a simple narrative of whether science of reading failed. If test scores don't suddenly skyrocket, changing systems is hard, she said. I'll just interject. That just happened in New York. Reading scores are down or flat after all the change. And I think the journalists like Hanford knew this was going to happen. I think you'll see more and more of this. It's going to be interesting. A new round of NAEP will be out in the fall, and we'll be able to, to have a look at that. From 2019, though, to the 2022 NAEP, states, almost every state went down. So one thing we do know for sure is if the science of reading is as effective as people say it is, it certainly, didn't change the dip with COVID. So COVID is a good example of out of school factors and how they impact learning. And I don't think there's any reading or any education reform that is going to offset significant out of school factors. In red here, I think this last comment by Hanford is incredibly important. Keep your eyes on this one and don't let this one go. Hanford said, reporters did, I think, largely turn away from how kids learn to read. And I think that's part of how we ended up in the situation we're in now. We get to be the watchdogs. We get to be the ones who can contribute to what happens. Um, I think the media, the journalist attitude toward teachers and toward teacher educators has been extremely condescending. And I really think saying they're the watchdogs is one of the most condescending things I've read in the media. I think that's where we're standing. These journalists have no background in education. They haven't been teachers. They actually don't even understand the research that they're writing about. I go over some of this journalism in one of my courses at Furman, and my undergrads are often shocked when a journalist writes an article and says research says. We click the hyperlink, and the hyperlink goes to another article by that same journalist, not to any actual research. So the science of reading movements are yet another cycle of Trojan horse education reform. We've already opened the gates and waved this in with blinders on. So now we must do our best to reclaim teaching and learning that serves the needs of our students and not the media, the market, and political ideological agendas at the expense of those students. What I have to emphasize now is almost all the claims in the science of reading movement are essentially ideological claims. They're not science claims. They're not evidence-based claims. They're not empirical claims. Um, and the most damaging of them are that we have a reading crisis and that it was caused by these specific factors. And it's always balanced literacy, 3Qing, which interestingly is banned in some states, even though most of the people who have banned it can't define it, and specific reading programs. These are mostly ideological, and they do come out of a very conservative ideology about not only teaching and learning, but about how schools function. I highly recommend Elena's work. And this other article, Politics of Phonics, How Power, Profit, and Politics Guide Reading Policies, very, very good piece. When it comes to politics of phonics, the more things change, the more they stay the same. This is about the phonics, the grounding of No Child Left Behind National Reading Panel, and how that was very grounded in sort of the politics of phonics. And when you read that article, it's pretty eerie how it's being replicated right now. And I do want to promote, we have a literacy program here at Furman. If you'd like to know about it, let me know. I don't know, Andrew, do we do questions? That's what I have.
Yes, we can open this up for questions if people have questions or comments. Sam has got his hand raised. Go ahead, Sam. Oh, let's see. If you would put your question in the chat box. I don't know this webinar if we can get let's see. Oh yeah, go ahead, Sam. You're allowed to talk.
Okay, I put a question in the chat box, and it has to do with Seidenberg, who just been an interesting person along the way, and sometimes a thorn in the side of some of the more ardent SOR people. But my big thing about Seidenberg is this, and I think I shared with both of you what he had to say, which basically says, in my mind, and I'm going to be writing about this, in my mind, what he's saying is that science of reading as it exists right now really overdoes the direct instruction and underdoes any kind of learning by doing kind of instruction. And he was very specific about that. I sent you the slide about what he had to say about that. So I just wonder what your thoughts are about, is that something that's happening? And is there any hope for, with people who are rather clearly identified with the science of reading movement, changing positions like this? Is there any hope for that common ground that I'm always trying to seek? And I know I'm Don Quixote on that, and I'm chasing windmills. But so what Seidenberg has to say, and any hope that that might lead to some form of common ground.
I'm not much interested in anything he says because he got us in this mess. I'm more concerned about the people that were saying the right thing all along. What I've noticed is several of the science of reading people that were on the bandwagon early have been backtracking quickly. I think we need to hold them accountable for their part in how all this happens. Seidenberg has been, over the years, he has testified at state legislators, and he's been very nasty to teachers, and he's been nasty to a lot of people that I know. So that he's changing his tune is interesting. I don't think it's actually helping. What I see is the rabid science of reading people have turned on him the same way they were attacking many of us. So it's not actually changing anybody's mind. But I do think if we're going to say anything about his new position, I think we've got to give him credit for starting this to begin with, which he was a huge part of this. He was a very big part of this, and the nastiness too. He was nasty. I know several accounts of his nasty and negative attitudes about classroom teachers. Although, some of the things that he has said, he admits that, a lot of this has been misunderstood and misdone.
Sharon Zinke, you have a question.
Sorry, I had to unmute.
Yep.
Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Yeah, I'm just been horrified by all this for as long as it's been going on. I've been teaching forever, over 50 years, and it's anyway, if you get rid of the 3 queuing systems, you basically say don't teach comprehension. My question is, is there any point in trying to get to Kamala? I know she's going to win. And I just wonder if, she'll be choosing somebody to run education. And I'm assuming this is recorded, right, Paul?
Yes,
Yes.
it's recorded.
And I'm somebody who will never I want to work with you, Paul, to do something about this, by the way. I've tried to reach you. I will do anything I can to get people to hear this recording. Anyway, you can tell I'm a little frustrated like everyone else. Do you think there's any point at all in trying to get the, people at the top to listen about this?
Yes, I actually think there is. I think the Biden administration very much was a softer version of the Obama, Arnie Duncan years, which were a disaster. Obama and Duncan were terrible for education. They were actually worse than the Bush administration. I think Harris picking Waltz was a huge positive sign because there were 2 other potential vice president candidates. I think their education policy would have been more like the Obama administration. I will say I've heard some recent rumbling that some of the Obama education people are being lined up for the Harris administration. So before it happens, I think it's a good time for us to make our voices be heard. We do not need to do education reform as it's been done because it's been bipartisan and bad for a very long time.
George Ruby is here. Go ahead, George.
Thanks. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Okay. All right. Well, Paul, great presentation. Thank you so much. And Andy, thank you for hosting this. This is wonderful, and we do have to stay honest. I like this metaphor of the Trojan horse. Although sometimes I feel that it's really more like that Trojan rabbit, you know, in Monty Python and the Holy Grail. You know, if you
Yep.
ever seen, well, because the difference is you know, that Trojan horse helped the Greeks to win in their battle against Troy, whereas, you know, and we have to talk about horsepower and all that. It's powerful, it works, right? And this stuff doesn't work, you know, and so it's really more like that Trojan rabbit. But it is sneaking things in, and you make a good point about the politics of it. There's an irony there that the churn, as you put it, is very much part of what's going on, and yet you refer to that political stance as conservative. You would think a conservative stance would want to keep things the same, but in fact, most of this is really rather radical right, rather than conservative in the small c homespun sense. So I think that's an important distinction to make. The other thing, though, that's being snuck in the Trojan horse or rabbit is the massive amount of technology that is now in the schools. I think I really believe that's where the money is, and I really believe that the jumping on this phonics bandwagon yet again, with an almost complete replication of what was, you know, went down in the early 2000s with Reading First, was just a way, because it was the quickest thing they could get up and running on their platforms. And you mentioned about how the financial interests that own you know, things like Lexia that produces letters or all of that, you know, that if you look to that, they did all their buying up after COVID hit. They went nuts with it. And why? Because of the post-COVID learning lag funding, $190 billion in funding between the Trump and Biden administrations. That's a lot of dough. And so they jumped in, and they got, you know, and the Wall Street Journal has said #1 use of that money, the largest share went to technology infrastructure, second largest to health infrastructure and personnel, and third to the programs that run on those platforms. And you know, you see that, and so you've got to wonder if I mean, we, as you point out very well in your tonight and in your blogs and your articles, your NCEP pieces and so on, we've never seen any great bump from switching our approach to phonics. But what it's remarkable that we've dropped post-COVID. That's not surprising. But since the COVID closures, you would expect to see some serious rebound, at least back to where we were in 2019. And that was a drop that people said at the time was a crisis. But we haven't gotten back up there yet. And you look at the kids who are in third grade right now, who are going to be taking that tests in their end of year state tests in the spring, and we'll be talking about this time next year. They weren't even in kindergarten when the COVID closures occurred. So you can't attribute that to COVID. All right. So something else is going on. Now, part of it is chasing out a lot of high quality teachers. You did a really good job explaining that at the beginning of this presentation. So thank you for that. But I think the technology is chasing a lot of the teachers out as well. Nobody wants to be a room monitor. They want to teach kids. And when the programs and the technology take that out of their hands, and yet you know darn well they're going to be held responsible for the failure when those systems don't work, that's just not right. So anyway, I'll shut up. But thank you so much for your great work. Love you guys.
Thank you, George. Now, I should clarify. I get the word churn from Bruce Biddle, who does school finance, and he's wonderful. And I think that's where the concept, he's been talking about this concept for a while. And I think George is exactly right. There's a connection here. If you redefine reading as simply pronunciation, that's something, and especially as nonsense words, that's something a computer program can do. And so there's a thread there of technology to deprofessionalize teaching. And I think it's incredibly important. I mean, that's an element I didn't mention here, and I'm glad George mentioned it, but there is a very strong technology thread running through this that links to both reductive views of literacy, but also deprofessionalizing teachers.
Jamie Romero had a question. She put her hand down, but if you want to ask your question now, your mic is open. And by the way, this recording will be on YouTube and it's available to anyone. So if you want to send it to someone, feel free to do that. Is there someone else that has a question or comment?
I'll ask my question. My question was really as regards, are you just bringing this information to the forefront, or are you proposing that there's a different solution, like giving teachers more autonomy and flexibility with curriculum, or focusing more on those outside of the school factors, or is there something else entirely?
Yeah, I've been doing this work for a long time. I would say I've been arguing for many, many decades that the first thing we should do for education reform is universal health care. At the very least, universal health care for children, food security, job security, access to books and access to text in the home, access to text in the neighborhood community, and access to books in the school. I also have laid out many, many equity reform plans over the years. I've got hundreds of things on my blog about this, but class size, how we assign teachers, Black, brown, poor, special needs students disproportionately are in classrooms with high student teacher ratios, and with teachers that are early career, and that teachers that are uncertified in the area that they're teaching. There are dozens of reforms that we could be doing that we're not doing that I guarantee would have a more positive impact on students. So regretfully, I've spent almost my entire time arguing against these reforms because it's the only thing we do. It's the same exact thing over and over. But yes, I've got plenty of plans and I've got plenty of alternative approaches, and they're all for free on my blog.
Kathy Havens, you have a question or comment?
Yes, I am a career teacher, currently retired. I work for a literacy nonprofit in North Carolina. One of our goals is getting books into the hands of kids, especially in areas where there are book deserts. But my question is, at a recent meeting I was at of other nonprofits, a presenter discussed the importance of listening comprehension, which grows out of having an adult share a book, talk about a book, and that begins the growth of how to comprehend what you're hearing, what you're reading eventually. But what I'm concerned about in our local schools is that with this huge shift back to the science of reading and the heavy phonics and dibbles and everything else, there's fewer opportunities for teachers to read aloud in their classrooms. And to me, that is terrible. So the nonprofits that I work with, our community of nonprofits, we're hoping to focus on the birth to 5 kids and hoping to get more done with them in listening comprehension, whether it's parent training, access to books, other initiatives like that. But have you heard much about this in the schools adopting science of reading? I know that they've packed away all the beginning readers, the little reader books. They're now using decodable text, which I think oftentimes don't make sense, and they aren't enjoyable for kids to read. So what are your thoughts on that?
Read alouds have been under attack for over 20 years. The anti-read aloud movement goes back at least to the No Child Left Behind and National Reading Panel era in the early 2000s, and it's a shame. I totally agree. I know for a fact, I hear from teachers all over the country where administrators ban them from read alouds. This has been happening for decades, and regretfully, I think it's even more intense. You're right. I think it's even more intensified now.
There was a question, Paul, about how do teachers in the trenches keep their heads above water with all the legislation?
That's a great question. I do think finding a community there are a community, there is a community out here among us who support the right way for doing things. I would say reaching out to professional organizations. I think NCTE and the state level NCTE, ILA, state level ILA, there are ILEC, our ILEC. You can find a community. I think it's really important not to be isolated. And not to be felt like you've done something wrong, or that, basically I think a lot of teachers are just being gaslighted, um, especially those that have taught 20 and 30 years. That's the ones I hear from the most, I think. The career teachers who are being told they don't know how to teach, which is, again, is really condescending, and it's just flat out not true. So I would say find a community. Professional organizations I really think professional organizations are very important.
And ILEC, International Literacy Educators Coalition, that is your community. There's over 300 of us now from across the world, and this is our place to find like-minded people. And we're getting our voice. We're learning how we can have a voice, but send me an email and I'll put you on the list. Another question, Paul. There is a debate between whole class instruction and small groups. What is your stance?
Again, I said I started year 41. I've done less and less whole class. I think small group and individualized instruction's where it's at. And I think all of it matters. You have to do whole group, you have to do small group, you have to do individualized. And that's why we have to leave it to the teacher. The teacher's the person who knows when that's best to do. Personally, I've been teaching writing for a very long time, and doing whole class instruction has very little impact on student essays. Having students write and then sit down individually with them, and you have the actual text in front of you, I see a great deal of growth and change. So I'm not against anything. I don't think there's a place for banning or mandating any one thing, because you never know. There's whole class instruction that is wonderful and very effective. There's whole class instruction that is fruitless. There's small group, the same thing. I've seen small groups be very ineffective and waste a lot of time. Actually, I think the only thing that pretty much works all the time is the one-on-one conferencing, which I'm a very big fan of. That's why I like workshop. The workshop model includes all of those. And that's why I've done that almost my entire career.
What suggestions do you have, Paul, for newer faculty who are trying to publish in areas that are not science of reading friendly? How do you navigate the current climate?
Well, I think you'll find that a lot of places are friendly. Most of the stuff that I publish now is invited. And if you look at my recent publications on my blog, it's a wide range of journals. NCTE has had several journals ask me to write about the science of reading specifically because of my stance. I currently have 2 pieces out there, one for a journal for administrators, and one for, it's an African-American scholarly journal. And so I think there are tons of places that are friendly to critical views of the movement, because it is misguided. I think there's more scholarly support for the position that I'm taking than the pro science of reading side.
How do you see the role of the National Board of Professional Teaching? Is it helpful, or is it also a Trojan horse?
Yeah, I've never been a fan of national board certification, mainly because of the same problem. National board certified teaching was a big thing in South Carolina, and it was a big bonus, but the research on it did not find it was effective. The biggest problem that I saw with national board, I saw wonderful teachers do it. Let me say that to be clear. But it was very onerous on their time in the classroom. I think it was very distracting from their teaching. The most effective thing for me was getting a master's and a doctorate. They had the most positive impact on my classroom instruction. So I'm biased in that. I think that's the best approach.
Adelphio has a question.
Thanks, Andy. Paul, what an excellent presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank
And
you.
I just heard about the administrators, and that's about my question. My question is, what suggestions would you give an administrator when they have the heavy central office opinions on science of reading, and when you look at your school, you see that your student population or demographics do not really benefit from what they actually see or tell you to do?
Yeah, I think this is really important. I think administrators are often the key. I think they have to be well informed. And speaking of school demographics, I think the most effective and the most important group right now that is pushing back on the science of reading are scholars and teachers of multilingual learners. And I think that's the key there is you see a state like California was able to turn back science of reading legislation. It was mainly driven by multilingual learner scholars and teachers. And the great argument there is that these so-called marginalized groups, no one size fits all works with MLL students. No one size fits all works with students with dyslexia. But guess what? It doesn't matter what group you're talking about. Silver bullets and one size fits all does not work for any students. So I do think I like your question because I think administrators have to start with who are we, why do we struggle, and what do we need, as opposed to box curriculum or top-down legislation. Box curriculum and top-down legislation will not serve the needs of students.
All right, we've got a question by Sam.
Okay, just but first of all, you've done a marvelous job. Just it's going to take weeks to unpack all the stuff you've given us. Thank you. But concerning the thought of the sciences of reading and folks that are talking about the sciences of reading, your thoughts about that, and also your thoughts about the importance of things like using music, using poetry, using repeated readings to build fluency, and those as an alternative, especially at the older grades.
Okay.
That those are things. So your thoughts about that?
And this will be the last question.
Well, Sam, I mean, we talk a lot. I'm just not an I don't really do the instruction stuff. I trust teachers. I think of course, all those things matter. I think they're all important. But I don't really focus on that this instruction doesn't work, that instruction does work. Also, I've given up on the term. I don't think sciences of reading helps us any more than science of reading. The terminology has been ruined. We've got science of math, science of learning, and it's all these are bully terms now. So I'm not looking for saving that term. I think it's done. And I think we got to go a different way.
All right. Thank you, Paul, for that wonderful presentation. Paul has to go now. If you want a certificate of attendance, send it to me. I'll put my email again in the chat box. And any other questions, you can email Paul directly. It has been wonderful to have you. We'll have an open discussion for everyone on the 17th, and I'll send you an invite. Also, if you are registered, I will send you a recording of this video tomorrow morning. Okay, join ILEC. It's a place for communities. Send me an email and I'll put you on the list. This is our place to find community, people. And hope to see you all at the next presentation. Good night, everybody. And I'll stay here if people want to talk to me, but they came to see Paul. They didn't come to see me. I would encourage you all to join ILEC. Let's build community. Let's have change. Sharon, Yes. And yep, go ahead, Sharon. You should be able to talk, Sharon.
There we go.
Good.
Yeah, I'm gonna write to you. But I was horrified with what I saw you write on LinkedIn about your syllabus, that you can't talk about certain things in your syllabus.
Yep.
Um, um, do you think that that's going on in a lot of universities?
Yes, they have an audit here in Minnesota that they'll go through my syllabi and they'll look for the 3 queuing systems. And that is in a lot of state legislatures, the state legislation. And it feels terrible. People who have no expertise in literacy. You know, I spent 40 years doing this, and someone who read a book comes and tells me what can and can't be in my syllabus. It's
That's crazy.
It is worse than crazy.
Well, how can you even teach if you can't talk about like the 3 queuing systems, for example? Then how can you talk about teaching reading?
What I do is I shut the door and do whatever the hell I want.
That's what I was wondering. That's what I've done for 50 years.
Yes, because I have an obligation, and this will last another 3 to 5 years, this science of reading
I
pending.
know.
And once they realize that this doesn't work, it'll go back and there'll be another thing in 5 to 10 years.
That's right. That's right. But my time is getting up there. I mean, you know, it's like I don't have that much time. So I really want to help do something about it. I'm going to write to you.
Okay, good. And it's us people who are near retirement. I think we're in the best position to make noise because
Yeah,
we don't care what they do to us at this point.
that's exactly right. Okay. I'll be in touch.
All
Thank
right,
you.
very, very good. Anyone else has questions or comment they want to say? This is your time.